The day fell toward evening across the hill country, the air cooling as shadows stretched long over the path that led to the river. Jacob stood at the edge of his camp and watched the caravan breathe, animals shifting, children settling, fires taking hold in shallow pits. Behind him lay the long years of exile, a ledger of wages and worries, a life built with patient hands. Before him lay a brother's country, and a meeting he could not predict. He counted flocks, counted faces, counted heartbeats, and none of his numbers could quiet the tide that moved through his chest. He had left home once with a staff and a promise. He returned with a household and a weight he could not divide. He worked order into the evening. Drovers eased herds toward water. Servants gathered packs and tents into tighter circles. Mothers wiped dust from small faces. The ground kept the warmth of the day, and smoke rose sweet and thin. Jacob moved among them like a hinge that held the camp together. A hand to a shoulder here, a nod there, a glance that set a pace for everyone to follow. When the light went pale, he sent messengers ahead toward the country of Esau. They ran into the dusk with steady steps, disappearing along the ridge as the first star showed and then another. Night lowered with clean certainty. The quiet of the hour lifted every small sound into meaning. The clink of a buckle, the soft splash of water at the river's bend, a sheep shifting in sleep. The messengers returned with news that cut through Jacob's composure. Esau was coming with many men. Nothing in that sentence told him love or anger. Numbers alone do not tell the posture of a heart. The uncertainty became a weight that would not move. He split the camp into companies, a strategy shaped less by fear than by the responsibility that had grown inside him over years. He had learned to tend, to measure, to protect, and he did what a shepherd does when dark hills carry unknowns. He put space between those he loved so that harm would not swallow everyone at once. The moon lifted, shadows shortened, then deepened. Jacob stayed in motion, sending gifts forward piece by piece, a quiet procession of animals and servants that walked into the darkness with instructions and hope. He placed his wives and children across the ford of the Jabbok, one group and then another, the water cool at their ankles, the stones round and slick beneath feet that trusted his hands. The river held a skin of light that rippled with every crossing. On the far bank, the camp grew quiet, fires small and watchful. He remained alone on the near side as the river thinned its sound into a hush. Solitude arrived like a presence, not like an empty frame. Jacob stood in it with the gravity of a man who had long wrestled with men and circumstances and with his own cunning. The night air settled heavy on his shoulders. He remembered a ladder in a dream, a stone pillow, a promise that broke open like dawn across a frightened heart. He remembered vows made with a younger voice, and he weighed them against all he carried now. The ground was firm, the sky clear, the river a steady line of shadow at his feet. Then a figure was there, not announced by sound or speech, only by the undeniable reality of contact. Hands met his shoulders with exact force, and his own hands answered as if they had waited all evening for this appointment. The two bodies locked and shifted. Feet slid on wet stones. Breath grew loud against the quiet of the water. This was not a struggle born of hatred. It was something older, something that asked a man to name what he had become and what he would be. Jacob felt the press of muscle and the precision of a will that matched his own. The river mist cooled his skin. Mud slicked his knees. The world narrowed to grip and balance, and the stubborn refusal to be broken. Time became uncountable. The moon crossed its slow arc. Jacob's mind ran through all the men he had wrestled in the story of his life. A brother who had always felt older than the room. A father whose blessing had hung like fruit just out of reach. A hard-handed uncle who measured loyalty by labor. He had wrestled by bargaining, by planning, by outlasting the night. None of that had prepared him for this. A contest with no words and no ground given. The figure moved with a restraint that felt like authority. Jacob answered with a tenacity that had grown from hunger into endurance. The fight drew them from riverbank to shallows, from stone to mud, from stance to stumble and back again. Near the setting of the night, a sharpness entered the struggle. The unknown one touched Jacob's hip with surgical aim, and something deep inside the joint gave way. Pain flowered hot and immediate. The limb held him no longer as it had. Balance faltered, and the next step threatened collapse. Yet he did not release. He bent his will around the pain and gathered himself with arms that had heaved stones and lambs and the weight of a lifetime. He held, not with the confidence of a victor, but with the insistence of someone who understood that this moment decided more than safety at a ford. It measured identity. It measured future. It measured the man. Dawn gathered at the edges of the world. The sky grayed. A soft rim of light rose behind the hills that hid his brother's approach. The fight changed not because the struggle lessened, but because a larger truth entered the scene. Jacob had not been overtaken by a thief or a rival. He had been met by the one who had found him once on a stone pillow. This was not a contest to destroy him. It was the appointment that would rename him. The figure moved with decisive grace, and the night around them felt like a curtain about to lift. When the first beam of day reached the river surface, the struggle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The unknown one did not fall or fail. He concluded. He marked Jacob with a wound that would govern his gait and with a blessing that would govern his story. The man who had entered the night as Jacob rose from the riverbank as Israel. He did not receive a title like an ornament hung around the neck. He carried a name that had been forged in sweat and water, in pain and communion. The limp said as much as any word could say. He had been brought low in the joint that keeps a man upright, and in that emptiness he had been filled with something larger than strength. He crossed the ford at morning, with the rest of the camp watching, children still and wide-eyed, servants holding breath, wives searching his face for the answer that son could not give. He walked toward them with a measured step, pain planting the foot and lifting it again, the rhythm of a new life working itself into muscle. The river behind him whispered of night and appointment. The bank before him spoke of day and consequence. He looked across the open land to the place where dust rose in the distance, the sign of his brother's approach. The fear that had moved like a second pulse inside his chest did not vanish. It shifted. It lost the power to steer him. He ordered the camp into a shape that spoke of care. Children placed where they would be protected, mothers near them, servants set where they could help. He took his place at the front, not as a shield for his heart, but as the head of a house that would bear a new name. The sun lifted and warmed his face. Footsteps beat a path behind him. Hooves thudded softly in the sand. He moved like a man who had looked into a mystery and survived its hold. Every step told the truth of the night. Surrender, then strength. Wound, then blessing. Loss, then a name that fit a future and not a past. The meeting came into view. Shapes that separated into men and animals. Faces lifted and fixed. The world held still for a breath. And then the next breath arrived. What passed between the brothers belonged to that hour and to the God who had governed it. The record would remember reconciliation, gifts accepted, words that made room for both men to live under the same sky without the old grudges tearing the ground between them. Jacob bowed the spine that now moved with pain and gratitude. Esau received what was offered and returned something larger. The day unfolded like a field after long rain, soft where it had been hard. When the camps pulled apart again, the road carried Jacob into a future that matched the new name he had been given. He moved with a limp that never quite left him. He built altars with hands that remembered the texture of wet stones and the weight of a grip that would not let go. The people near him learned a different pace, one set by a man who had learned that blessing can carry a scar and that scars can preach for years without bitterness. The children watched the way he walked and heard in that rhythm a story that would root their own. The wives learned the timbre of his quiet when evening fell and fires began to speak. Servants knew they served a master who had left a riverbank as someone else. He traveled on, and the land answered back with fields and seasons. At times he paused to build a marker, an upright stone, or a cleared circle where he could remember how a night had turned him. He taught his people to remove the small idols that anxiety builds and to move toward the one who had named him. He understood that identity was not a private award. It was a calling placed on a household. His tents found their places not by chance, but by a path that followed fidelity more than speed. He measured flocks and children with the same attentive eyes, and he spoke as a man who knew he had been seen and touched and not destroyed. A memory trailed him, not heavy, but constant. It returned with the smell of water, with the dark, quick chill that settles on skin just before dawn, with the ache at the top of the thigh when a step reaches too far. The memory did not accuse. It testified. It told him that he had faced a night no tactic could master, and had been mastered in a way that left him more whole. The world would still demand strength, and he would offer it, but not the kind that hides its fear in schemes. He offered the strength that bows and believes, the strength that can carry a household into reconciliation and a covenant into its next chapter. When he reached Bethel, the place where his younger self had once slept on a stone and dreamed the earth open to heaven, he returned to the ground with a deliberate tenderness. He put away what did not belong. He called his people to purification. He set his attention on the one who had found him at this place first in promise and later in struggle. He built an altar and gave the day a frame that would not rot with weather or time. The name of God spoke over him again, not to replace the night at the river, but to confirm it. The blessing that pressed into his hip now pressed into his household with hope. The boy who had gripped and grasped had become a man who held and yielded. Israel, not as a boast, but as a witness. The journey moved on and bore the marks of a family's life, sorrows and births and burials, woven into one fabric that only faith can keep from tearing. Jacob kept walking with the gait that told the old truth in a new rhythm. He watched the faces of his sons and saw in them futures he could not control and promises he could not manufacture. He tended what could be tended. He named what could be named. He rested his weight on a staff when the day grew long, the wood warm under his palm, the memory of a night in his bones, and the reality of a blessing in his breath. In time, the people who called him father or master or patriarch would tell his story around their own fires. They would whisper the river's name like a password to courage. They would point to a man's step and say that humility can carry a nation further than swagger. They would teach their children that there is a strength that wins by losing, and a victory that arrives after surrender has done its hidden work. They would explain that God does not always meet a person in a dream. Sometimes he meets him in sweat and strain until dawn writes a new identity across a tired face. The land that had seemed like a threat from the far bank of a river became the land where his tents felt at home. The brother who had once filled his imagination with fear became a neighbor whose presence did not steal air from his lungs. The children who had watched him limp learned to match his pace instead of running beyond him. He understood that this too was part of the blessing, to have a house that moved together rather than scattering under pressure. He knew well that there would be more nights and more appointments, that the story of his family would carry trials he could not imagine. Yet the river had already taught him the main lesson. He would not be alone at those crossings. So the second part of his story closes at the place where a river bends and night yields to day. A solitary man walked into darkness, heavy with fear of what awaited him, and a renamed man walked out, marked, slowed, and truer. What happened in the water shaped every meeting that came after, including the one at the edge of his past where he feared the most. The blessing did not erase history. It rethreaded it. The wound did not disqualify him. It tutored him. He left the river not as a fugitive from his brother and his own choices, but as a father of a people who would carry his new name through centuries, like a banner and a question answered. Some nights refuse easy sleep, and some crossings cannot be delayed. Strength in those hours is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to keep standing in the place where God meets a life and changes its name. Jacob walked away with a limp, and it made him whole. When the day asks more than we can give, there is a way to be blessed that begins where our own power ends.